everybody, this is Leo from Daddy's Game Time, and we're here at Poly San Luis Obispo at the Polycon 2015, and I'm here with Luke. Luke, how are you today?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Luke, what do you like about Polycon? Why do you keep coming back?
Well, I've been coming to Polycon for several years. It's a smaller convention, but it's fantastic. It has a lot of heritage because it's one of the oldest conventions around. It's been going on since late 70s, I believe, early 80s maybe. And there's a lot of great people here, a lot of locals, but people come from the Bay Area and people come from down in LA too. Not a lot, because it's not a huge convention, but it's a great place where you can play with your friends, because I'm local, I'm from Santa Maria, and but also you can meet some new people too, and just try out lots of great games.
Excellent. Now, we've been learning a lot about the different genres of games that are available here. What are your favorites?
Well, for a lot of years, for most of my gaming career, my life, I played Dungeons and Dragons. When Magic the Gathering was really popular, I got into that for several years. But I've gravitated into more, now what are most commonly referred to as Euro-style board games.
Now, tell us about Euro-style. I've heard that word thrown around. I'm not exactly sure what that means, though.
Some people don't like the definition because games have taken on so many different manifestations that it's hard to classify them. But some general concepts behind what are traditionally considered to be Euro games is that they revolve around some fairly complex mechanisms. They can seem kind of abstract. They may use a lot of cubes. Sometimes they're called cube pushers. Cubes, tiles, cards, in many different combinations. But they tend not to be violent, or they tend not to be war type games. They tend to be deep thinking games that really test the player's abilities to develop long-term strategies, and they tend to reward players who have the ability to really think through problems very carefully.
So it's a lot of, would you say, mechanics similar to like a chess game, but maybe with just different elements, like you mentioned, dice, the boards, the cards, etc.
Yeah, if you're going to classify chess would usually be considered an abstract game in modern times. So you have pieces that, while they may look like a horse and it may look a little like a king or a queen, they really are just piece A, piece B, and piece C, and they each have a separate rule that goes with them. So they're a piece with a rule. With Euro games, there tends to be a little more of a flavorful feel to them. So for example, you might play the game Castles of Burgundy, in which each player is trying to, while mechanically they're gathering tiles that represent resources and goods that they're shipping, and they represent little parts that they're building in this, developing their own little kingdom. But the flavor of it is such that you're in this green, hilly countryside of Europe, and that you're trying to aspire to a level of power. So there's a lot of flavor in these games that is that's different from like a game like chess, where it's more just a matter of different rules for different pieces.
Now, the name itself implies European, Euro. Did these originate in Europe, or is it because of something else?
Yeah, and I'm not an expert in this, but I'll repeat some things that I've heard. But the general idea is that Euro-style board games, as we call them now, previously were more commonly called German-style board games.
Oh.
And that they arose in a time period post-World War II, 50s, 60s, 70s, these games gradually evolved long before we had anything here of similar caliber. A lot of the board games that you find like on the store shelves today are the same games that have been there for 30, 40 years in the United States. But in Europe, they've had this rich tradition of these games. Now, it's important to point out that they did not have war games in Europe. So while in the United States there's a lot of this war and violence in games, in Europe they were very anti-war. This was
Right.
kind of a
Is it because
consequence of losing World War II and all of the warfare that region had seen. So that carries into the modern Euro games, and that they tend to have low level of violence and a high level of thinking and strategy. But games in Europe today, even though we're talking about just Germany, from what I've heard, they sell more board games in just Germany than they sell in the United States today.
Wow, that's
So
quite the
it's big
statistic.
business.
Yeah, because if you look at the physical size of Germany and population of Germany compared to the United States, you would think the United States has the upper hand as far as sales go. However, reality is a little different. How do you see the popularity of video games compared to board gaming? And what would you say to somebody like a teenager, for example, that was very into video games, but you were trying to convince them, like, hey, try out this other style of gaming?
Yeah, so there is some overlap between like electronic games and board games, and I think the kind of the transition, the medium of transition is the phone or the iPad, the i-type device or tablet type devices, because there are a whole lot of board games now that are apps. And many of them are selling really, really well. So you may find a fairly common app like a Settlers of Catan app or a Ticket to Ride app. And that could be a gateway to someone transitioning from playing electronic games to then playing real cardboard video games.
That's true. I never thought about it that way. The phones nowadays, the smartphones, are a good gateway or a good middle point between both worlds, isn't it? Yeah, our friend Rick from Daddy's Game Time, there's this game he raves about. It's almost like a card game. What's the name of it? Hearthstone. Have you ever played?
No,
Hearthstone?
but I've heard it's entirely a card game, but it's entirely digital, right? There is no physical version of it, but it still is a card game.
A lot of the games that we're going to see today, are these games you think that could be maybe transitioned to a digital format someday?
Some of them probably are. Some of them are video games already or have electronic versions of them. But going back to your original question too about just popularity of video games, I know that in my house we play a lot less video games now. We play more board games. You get more into one hobby, you get less into another. There's a tendency for that. But I think some of the appeal that draws people to video games is different from what draws people to board games, because board gaming is a really social activity. And so when a family is sitting around playing a real board game versus everybody staring at the same screen, it's a different dynamic. Yeah, you might feel social interaction and a level of excitement playing something like Smash Bros, but it doesn't force you to play by the same rules. Everybody's just slamming away at their controls, right? But you sit down at a board game and everybody is talking about the experience, and they're reminding each other of the rules. They're reminding each other of it's like
you're constantly engaged, constantly
you're engaged, and you're also teaching each other as you go. And so I think that has a better overlap for developing good social skills than video games do. But I'm not opposed to video games. I think video games are great too. But I think board games offer something different.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, I'm primarily a video gamer myself. But when you put it that way, I agree, because not so long ago, I started teaching my 7-year-old daughter how to play chess. And I discovered that there's a lot more engagement there. There's a lot more commitment, even though it might not take as long of the time span as say playing a video game would. However, the engagement is much more magnified, the level of communication that it requires. So that's great how you saying this kind of giving me an epiphany right now, and it's
I've written a few pieces on board gaming with your family, and I think it's key.
Now,
I have a son and I have a daughter. My son is 15. He's been playing games with me of all kinds his whole life. He's a little less into it now. He's doing more of his own thing. but my daughter's still of the age where she just wants to play games with dad. And that is a really special thing because it also creates something that you both are drawn to together.
Right.
You're saying, okay, this is a way, especially for fathers, especially in a world where we're trying to get fathers more involved, right? This is something where dad looks forward to sitting down with his daughter or with his son, and mom and the whole family can get around this game, and you can have these kinds of engagements that is a little different from just like arguing over what you're going to watch on TV.
Right.
And storming off, or everybody in their own room with their own TV and their own device and all that.
Yeah, that's true. What kind of life lessons or life values do you think you might have learned yourself, or also have your children learned from playing together?
Well, one is it just plain makes you smarter. You are constantly putting yourself in a position where you are given challenges and you have to make decisions. A lot of times they're based on limited resources and making the most out of them. It translates into almost every aspect of life. But another key one is about patience, and that you do not necessarily get a lot of return in the very short term in these games. Video games are the opposite that way too. It's all about, I'm going to bust out this mean old combo and I get instant gratification.
Right.
With a board game, sometimes it's a little, you get little piecemeal rewards and then you get a big reward later.
Right. It's more about thinking ahead, the end game.
Yeah. Good life lessons, I think.
Well, that's great. I did have a question right now, but I think my mind just went off. Oh yes, what games would you suggest or recommend that are games for somebody who's just starting out and wants to play with their family, that are gonna help with this that we've been talking about, development and communication?
Well, I think it really varies highly based on player preference, and it varies a lot on people's other experiences. A lot of people have moved towards Settlers of Catan as one, and it has its strengths and weaknesses. For a lot of people, playing games like Magic the Gathering draws them in thematically, and they like all this fighting and collecting the cards and everything. The danger with something like Magic, though, with danger or benefit, is people get hooked on that one thing, and then they don't branch out, right? So another one is Dominion. And Dominion creates a level playing field where everyone sits down and they're building their card decks right there. This is an interaction where everybody has equal
Now, are
field.
these games children can play?
Yes. Pretty much all those games, you're looking at children as young as 8, 9, depending on their, part of it's their mathematical skill. In some cases, it's reading ability. I'm a game designer also, and I do have a game that is very playable for kids. However, my game has some nudity on some of the cards. So it's called Stones of Fate, and it has a tarot theme to it. But it's like an advanced version of memory, but it also has this element of spatial awareness.
Yes.
So if you're in Santa Maria, they sell it at the game store in Santa Maria. And the basic idea is that you're placing stones and you're flipping over cards that determine your fortune. So you're gathering these cards and trying to accumulate the best fortune of the collection of cards you have.
That's great. And how does one come up with the vision to create a game like this and have it developed?
That's a great question, and I've been designing games for about 4 or 5 years now. And I don't know if there's a magic answer to how you come up with games, other than that, for me, a lot of my inspiration comes from playing other games. So you start to play other games, you get a feel for how they work, and then you imagine how they could work differently. You imagine what elements you might take away or add or change, or you may come up with your own little twist of mechanics that uses different pieces or something like that.
Right.
So a lot of ways to go about it.
And how does the process start? Do you start writing out like a storyline perhaps, or do you just go into the mechanics of it, the gameplay?
Yeah, for sometimes for me, the inspiration will begin as a theme. So for example, there's a game I'm working on that's based on the state of California right now. The
Yes.
idea is building up the state of California with the kinds of things that California is famous for. In that, the mechanics came after the theme to a degree. In some other projects I've worked on, I came up with cool ideas for how to do parts and points and things, and then thought of, well, what kind of flavor do I want to give this? Do I want to make this science fiction?
Right.
Do I want to make this fantasy? How am I going to make this interesting? So another game that I have that's in the process of development with a publisher is based on the theme of nations building their economies while trying to balance the harm that they do to the environment.
Oh,
So
interesting.
it's a tough challenge because while you are building up your economy, every choice you make can potentially also cause you some harm. And so you're balancing the pros and cons of each decision you make.
Wow, sounds like it's gonna build some political minds there for the future, and hopefully they'll make the right choices.
We're all better off if people are smarter and can make better choices.
Yeah. So do you try to teach through your games that you develop, or is it just all for fun?
I haven't done, and I am a teacher. I've been a science teacher for many years, and I have incorporated some game-like things into my classroom, but I've never built a game that was strictly a teaching game. It wasn't designed to teach a particular lesson. For example, in the game I just described, it's entirely possible for someone to be successful in that, potentially making some of the choices that might sound kind of wrong, as long as what they did maximized the opportunities that they had. So it doesn't guide the players to make a certain choice, because that would be no fun.
Right.
You want to give them a scenario and set the stage for them to be able to make a wide variety of choices and pursue their, kind of have their own creativity and have their own solution, their own best path, so to speak.
Now you mentioned teaching in the classroom environment. What is that like from a gamer's perspective? What I mean to say is, do you try to incorporate a lot of these strategies from learning how to play games to engage the students, and what kind of results have you had?
Well, so I played Dungeons and Dragons for a lot of years. And Dungeons and Dragons is played where you have a dungeon master, and they're the person who's kind of in charge of it all. They set the stage, they describe the scenario, and they plan ahead so that they can anticipate the decisions and choices that the players will make. A friend and I have had a conversation where we talked about how every teacher should be required to play Dungeons and Dragons. Because you walk into a classroom, you're the dungeon master.
That's true.
You have to have planned, and you've had to anticipate all the possible actions that your players, which are your students, would take. And you don't know exactly what you're going to do. But a good dungeon master plans ahead, and they also can ad lib as needed. So you've got to be prepared for people to go off the beaten path. I teach junior high. There is no beaten path. The kids come in and they do what they're going to do. That's not their fault. That's their age. That's my responsibility. I have to walk in ready to ad lib like that. But the other thing that games can teach us as life lessons, and games can help us be better educators, is that games provide motives. They provide motivations for people to try to succeed. You sit down at a game and you find out, I'm going to be making money, or I'm going to be getting victory points, or I'm going to be getting more cards, or whatever it is. All of a sudden, these things become these incentives. They're like, you know, Sonic the Hedgehog, picking up those coins, getting those little ding, 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 ding. It's those little kinds of rewards. And in a classroom, our classroom needs to have a sense of rewards. It doesn't mean giving them candy. It doesn't mean taking a day off and watching a movie. In my class, one of the things that I do is I have cards where I randomly call on kids and ask them questions. They get it right, they get a plus point. They get it wrong, they get a minus point. There's a game in that it's random. There's a game in that there's a reward. It's a game in that there's a penalty. And it adds a level of just enough anxiety. It keeps them on their toes, but it also makes them more engaged.
Sounds like in itself that should be a game you should develop, possibly.
There you go.
Well, Luke, thank you very much for joining us.
It's my
Very
pleasure.
insightful. My pleasure. For all of you at home, this has been Daddy's Game Time. your host, Leo, along with Luke.